Hey guys, in this video series I'm working on a Raspberry Pi Facebook chatbot that will send you a new news article every morning. And as part of the project I want to make sure that my chatbot can understand natural language. So in this part I'm going to take a look at Wit.ai and incorporate some natural language understanding into my bot so that it understands my intent. Like I've said before, these videos are going to be about 99% code, so if you're not interested in that kind of thing, I would turn the video off now. Otherwise, let's get started. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is start off with Wit.ai, and you can go to, if you just go to Wit.ai in your browser, it'll take you to this site, and you can either sign in with Facebook or GitHub, and you can start working on a project. So I'm going to start with this. I did some more work on the news bot, but I'll get to that after this. So let's get started. At the top here, you'll see that there are a bunch of different tabs, and some of these aren't completely built out yet. As you can see, Stories is still in beta. The main tab that we're going to work with is this Understanding tab, and you can really fall into the rabbit hole when you start working on this kind of thing. And you can really build up your AI to do a bunch of different things, but it takes some time to train your bot and teach it how to respond to different scenarios. So what you do when you open up the app here is you start typing sentences that somebody could ask your bot. And as you add more sentences, the bot learns intent. So let's say here I start with a greeting. I say hi. At first, it doesn't know what intent that I have when I say hi, but I can add an intent to let it know this means a greeting, for instance. So I'm going to type a new entry here. I'm going to call it intent. So I've created a new entity called intent, and I want to give it the value of greeting. So my intent for this message is to greet the bot, and I'll validate that. So let's try another one. Let's just say hello. So since the only intent it knows is greeting, it thinks that this is a greeting, which it is. So I'm going to validate this as well. But let's say that I want to ask the bot what the news is. I can say, what's the news? It's going to think that my intent is a greeting, which it's not. But that's because my bot only knows that the intent is a greeting. So I'm going to change this to say, my intent is news. Let's call it general news. And I'll validate that. Now let's say we want to search for local news. When the user says, what's going on around me, it knows that the intent is not a greeting, but we want to drill down and make sure that the bot knows that this is local news. So I'll change this to local news and validate this. So if I change to what's happening around me, it should pick up the fact that this is local news because of probably these two words around me. So we'll validate that. So you can kind of build up your bot. It takes a lot of time to do this. So what you really have to do is just kind of sit down and start thinking of all the different queries that somebody could ask your bot. And as you start adding more queries, it will get better at understanding what the intent of your query is. Another thing you can do is add multiple levels to your intent of your query. So say we want to have the bot respond to a time-based query where the user asks what the news is for a specific day or time. We can say, what's the news today? And I'm going to switch this to general news, and we can add a new intent to this as well. So Wit.ai comes with a bunch of entities already built in. So there's this one called date time, and it should be able to find a keyword in your query that represents a day or a time. So in this case, what's the news today? It finds the keyword today and knows that today means July 16th. So I'm going to validate this. And let's say we want to add another query just to test this out. So I'm just going to type the query, what happened yesterday? And it picks up the date time of yesterday, but it's not smart enough to find the intent of news. So I'm just going to add that. And once I start adding a bunch of queries, it will slowly but surely get better and understand the sentences that I ask it. It'll pick out intent, and you can respond based on that particular intent. So if I go into my intent menu here, you can see all of the queries that I've asked the bot, and you can see the different traits. So we have 3 traits right now, and what you would do with these traits is listen for them on your app and respond differently based on those traits. So for general news, I would first, for instance, say just query general news on Google News. Local news, I could figure out maybe by the Facebook ID where the user is located and query for news local to that user. And for greeting, I could just, say have a few canned responses to respond to the user. So I'm going to start adding some other queries in here and validate their intents so that I can make my bot a bit smarter, and then I'll come back and show you the stories tab. All right, I've taught the bot a few different queries, and now it understands intent in terms of news and a few other random things pretty well. So if I type tell me, or maybe show me what's going on tomorrow, it should be smart enough to understand that this is a general news intent with also the date time of tomorrow, so we can respond accordingly. I've also added a few more random intents. So there's a trait for jokes, identification. So if the user asks, who are you? More news. So say in the case that there's a multi-turn query, if the user first asks for what the news is, and then they want to see more, show me more, things like that would be the trait of more news. Local news, like we created, and greeting. So if I scroll down here, I can see all the queries I've added. There's a ton of queries, and this really is what helps your bot become smarter. You hear about a lot of different companies training their bots, and this is basically what they're doing. Users ask queries, and then they have people sitting behind the scenes looking at how the bot's responding and then correcting it if it's wrong. So now that we've done this, we can start adding stories. And stories are basically how your bot decides to respond to somebody, what text it responds with. You can also use stories to keep track of multi-turn queries. So let's add a few stories so that you can kind of understand what I'm talking about when I say that. So the first story, let's just say this is our first story where the user greets the bot. So we can say hi. It should know that this is a greeting, which it does. And then say we want our bot to respond with, hey, and maybe a waving hand emoticon or something like that. So this is a story. We can create another story. Let me save this first. We can create another story. So say we want this story to just respond to the user when they ask for news articles. So let's just say here, what's the news? And this should know that it's the intent of general news. And the bot can say, here's what I found. And then we can execute a function. Let's call this get general news. And then we want to update context key with articles. So the function will get news articles. It'll update the context. And then it will send back articles. Oops. So this is how you represent a variable in this stories tab. You just do open close brackets articles, or curly braces, sorry. So this is another story. Let's make sure to save this. Now let's create one more story for news that holds a context. So in this case, let's do what's the news again. And then the bot will say, here's what I found. It will execute get general news, update context key with articles, and then it will send back articles. But say the user then asks or states, show me more. If the next intent is more news, the bot should perform a different action. And this will only happen if the first query was what's the news, or the intent was find general news. So in the case of our story hi, where the user just says hi, and then they say show me more, it won't be the same context as this story, so it won't perform this action. But since we set this story up to look for the context of the last query as what's the news, or the intent of general news, it should perform this next action. So the bot can say, here are a couple more articles, and then it can execute a new function that says get, let's say get batch articles. Update context with more articles. And then send more articles. We can also add stories for some of the other random intents that I added. So I added one with the intent of identity. And this would be if the user asks, what's your name, or who are you? So let's just add that story as well. And so it knows that the intent of this is identification, like it should be. And let's say the bot should respond with newsbot, because it's a newsbot. Maybe we'll add another emoticon to this as well. So if I save this, we should be able to test chatting with our bot. And we can do that by hitting the tilde key. So it knows I asked a greeting. it finds news articles. Let's verify that it will update the context keys with articles, and then it will send back articles. Looks like I had a typo there. I can go back and fix that. But you just really have to layer these stories up, and then your bot can really kind of hold a personality once you do that. So I'm going to add a few more of these, and then let's jump into the code and start hooking up some of the functions we wrote for the past parts. All right, so now we're back on my Sublime text editor. And since the last video, I noticed that there is a bug. So this cron job that we set up was actually executing every minute of the hour because this 0 was a star. So I changed that to a 0. So now what's happening is this is only executing on the first minute of 9 o'clock. So before it was sending a bunch of messages, but now it's only sending one. Another thing to note is that this function will get articles and then send to each user. So it only gets articles once. But if a user were to query our bot and say spam it for a bunch of articles, we could potentially get blacklisted by our endpoint for the Google News. I noticed this when I was testing some things out, and actually when I was running this cron job and I had that weird bug, I got blacklisted because I was querying their servers too many times. A way to fix this would be to set up a new model for your Mongoose database that would basically just store the articles once an hour so that you have a cache of articles, and then when the users query for articles, you would just get the articles from your database instead of hitting that endpoint every single time for every single user. I'm assuming that Google probably rate limits people how many times they can hit that endpoint. I'm not going to change it because this is just my personal news bot, and in the interest of time, I think it would be best not to change it. But it would be pretty straightforward. All you have to do is just create another Mongoose schema for article and then save a few articles. And then pull the 5 most recent ones. Another thing to note is some of the documentation for Messenger platform changed since the last video I made, and it hasn't affected our code per se. All they changed really was the documentation for the sample app. So now they have several types of message events that could occur. So before we were just checking if there was a message event, but now there's a messaging event for message, delivery, postback, all things that can happen when you send your message. So for instance, the delivery would happen when you're notified that the message was delivered to the user. This does not affect our code because we check for the message event here to see if it's a message and that it is text. So this is just a different version of what we have. And then down here, you can also have different message text based on what type of message it is. So they have image, buttons. So that doesn't really matter again because we're just using text right now, but you could potentially just check this message.text to see what type it is. But our code still works regardless, so I'm not going to update it. If you wanted to, you could add more cases here that handle different messages. So, moving along. Now I want to hook up my Wit.ai that I've created. And there is a Node module for Node.js, but it requires that you use ES6, which is a different version of JavaScript. It's the newer version, which is more object-oriented than its predecessor, which is what this is. And it's also kind of difficult to load that onto the Raspberry Pi. I've had some trouble with it in the past. So I'm just going to keep my code as is, not try to use ES6 and explain that, but instead use the Wit HTTP API instead of the node module. So if I go back to Wit and then I go to my app, I can click on docs up here and it will take me to the documentation for using Wit in your server. There's a Node.js. Like I said, I'm not going to work on that. I'm going to use the HTTP API. And all we have to do is use this command right here. So like I did before in my code, when I sent a message, I used the request node module. And let's see where this guy right here. And so I just basically hit an endpoint, passed some parameters, and it gave me back data. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. And this is a header, so it has an authorization header. And then you just have a GET request with a query. And so this query will need to be URL encoded. So I'll do that. You can test this out by just copying this and running it in your terminal. You can get to your token by going to settings. And I am going to delete this app after I publish this video. So I'm just gonna, I don't care if you see my token. And I can copy this, go to my terminal. And if I run it with the query, hello, it gives me this JSON object representing what the bot understands from this query. So we have a entity which is intent, and our intent has the value of greeting. So like we set up before, we can see here that our bot recognizes this query. So all I have to do is basically call this API when the user queries the bot and it's an unrecognized command. And then based on this value, I will call a function and return some data. So let me set that up now. All right, so I took some time to write this function, and I didn't record it just to cut down on the screen time. But basically what it does is call the Wit HTTP API. And in order to do this, I had to set up a few properties. So like we did in the last video, I added these two properties. So I have my Wit token, which is just an environment variable like I did for the Facebook token. And again, you can set that by running export set Wit token equals single quotes the token value in your terminal. And that has to be reset every time unless you set a config to set that somewhere. And then my endpoint is just what was on the Wit.ai website. It's their message API. And you would just append the query to the end of this. So going back to my api.js file, I have this function here that URI encodes the query. So if there are any spaces in between words, it would add a plus. There are some symbols that you have to translate to specific codes for the URI, and this function does it for you. I then have a request, and this request has the access token that we had earlier. The method is get, and then I have my property endpoint, and I'm appending the query. So when it responds, I get this body which I have to parse, and the body has a a couple of parameters on here. So let me show you in the terminal. Here I have like I said earlier, the entities object. There's an intent, and it can have several values. So this value, so I tested out here with a greeting. It gives me the greeting. And so I just use this to extract that value. So it will be the first value, the most confident value. And then I use a callback to so that I can respond after I get the information. So right now I'm just logging the intent, but I'm going to rewrite this slightly so that we can take action either by sending an article message or just a canned response. So let me do that now. Okay, so I've rewritten a bit of the code, and in this handle message function in the last default case, if you remember, we had another if-else statement where at first I would get the articles, and then I check if it was a show more normalized string. If it was show more, I would get 5 articles. If it was not, I would send back 1. Instead, now we're replacing it with this function that I just created in order to get the intent of the text. And then once we have the intent, I have this new function called handle intent. And this basically just takes the intent and maps it to a canned response. So if we look at this function, I have another switch statement for intent. And all of these cases are the different intents that we can have. And I have a few canned responses, and you can layer these up too. And maybe, if you want, for instance, for the jokes intent, if you wanted like 20 jokes, you could just have a joke lookup, randomly pick a joke from the lookup table. But for this, I just have 1 joke, and I think that's probably fine. We have greetings, identification, and then for the news, we just use that function we created earlier to get articles. Once we have the articles, we can first send a message saying that we're about to send something back, like how about these, for the case of more news. And for more news, I send back 5 articles. General news, I send back 1. And local news, since I didn't spend the time to localize the news, I just sent back the same thing as general news, but with a text message before that says, I don't know local news yet. And in the default case, if it doesn't understand the intent, then I just send back the message saying, I'm not sure about that one yet. So if I go to the messenger, I can start having a conversation with the bot. So if I say hi, it should respond hi. Maybe tell me a joke. Tells me a joke. Let's see, what are some of my other intents? I can say, what's the news today? Should send me a news article and another text message above that. And then maybe the last thing we'll ask it is, what's your name? I'm Newsbot. And the cool thing is, because we've taught the bot how to respond to different queries, and it's learned intent, anything we ask it with the intent that aligns with what we've taught it in the Wit.ai console, it will understand. So if I add another sentence here, do you have a name? It should send me the same thing back because the intent is still identification. And the cool thing about this is you can go straight back to your Wit console, and if you go to the understanding tab, you can continually teach your bot to learn new intents. So if you want to add a new intent, you just start validating a new intent, adding a bunch of queries, and teaching it how to respond. And you can just add a new case in this function and respond accordingly. So the intelligence of your bot is really based on how you train it. So right now my bot's not very intelligent, but if you were to continue working on this, you can definitely train your bot to be a lot smarter. Alright guys, unfortunately this is the last part in the Raspberry Pi Facebook Chatbot series. I may visit it once more in a video or two if Facebook announces any big features. But until then, I'm going to start working on some other projects, including some iPhone apps, robotics. I've also tagged all of this code on GitHub. So if you want to work step by step with the videos, I should have tags for all of those that you can download separately. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to keep up to date with all of our other projects, including our robotic bartender, which mixes drinks for you. But until then, see you next time.